If you wouldn't mind just starting us off with introducing yourself and what brought you to the Exchange interview today.
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Liz, and to ResourceX as well. I always enjoy doing this sort of thing. Some of you who have known me for a while or worked with me before will know that one of my company, which is called Strategic Steps, one of our values is about we call wisdom, and it talks about sharing what we know. And for that reason, it's kind of neat to have been involved in this realm for the last few decades. I started accumulated enough knowledge to start turning that around and being able to provide information out. So webinars or podcasts is really quite fun, particularly if they're interactive. So I'm kind of hopeful that we'll get to some of that. But the other piece we do, I really enjoy doing is conference speaking. And I was just telling Liz before most of you joined that I was in Charlottesville, Virginia, just before COVID hit. And for those of us who are Canadians, going to the States in February when it's nice and cold up north is kind of a nice bit of a break. The year before that, I was in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and I've also spoken in places like Boise. And I did a city council orientation in Corona, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, and that was January of 2018, I think. And so just a really nice break from winter, sorry. But anyway, the question was how I came around to doing this. I've been on the periphery of priority-based budgeting for many years, mostly through Kelly, and a little bit through Chris and Eric and their work in Strathcona County, which is where I live. We were having some conversations a few weeks ago with all four of us, about a variety of topics, and this ResourceXchange had come up. We've mentioned John Dance, who was one of the former participants in this, and John and I have been friends for years, and it seems like a fairly small community. So when I can't remember if it was Eric or Chris who suggested that it'd been kind of interesting to hear a slightly different perspective, I was more than happy to sign up and have this conversation. The corollary to this is that I've got a new book that's just coming out this month as well, and we may get to that a little while later. So hopefully that shows up on your reading list by the end of it all. I'd hold it up in front of me and wave it around, but it's so new that I haven't even got a copy myself yet. It was printed over the last couple of weeks. Anyway, the book is called Who's Driving the Grader and Other Governance Questions. And the title is an interesting one because it speaks to the role of governance versus management and administration, and who's supposed to do what, and how there's supposed to be a bit of an hourglass with the governors, members of city, county council, town council at the top end, running through to the bottom end, which is where the actual services get delivered. And then the pinch point is the city manager or town manager, and talking about which roles are most appropriate. It was kind of fun too, because people who work in local government typically understand the meaning of the title and kind of get it. I told my mom what the title was, and she had no idea and wondered why the hell I called the book Who's Driving the Grader? What does that mean? Why is there a picture of a grader on the front of the book? So anyway, the long and the short of it is, this is a bit of a tangential alignment to priority-based budgeting or priority-based business intelligence. But to me, good governance is good governance, and the principles apply whether it's a tool or whether it's a process, or whether you're looking at elections of local elected officials. So Liz, that's a really long answer to what you had was a pretty short question.
So that was a great answer to the question. And it's going to bring me back to, we are definitely going to dive into asking some more detailed questions about your book. But in the interest of adding to our recommended reading, what is your favorite book?
My favorite, so there are a couple of favorites here. One is favorites just as frivolous type favorite. And when I was a kid, I had multiple copies of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and the whole series, because I used to lend them out to people. And it's just a kind of crazy book that they tried to make TV series out and tried to make movies out that just didn't work. But there were some pithy pieces in there, one of which actually made it into Who's Driving the Grader. And there's a if anybody's familiar with the series at all, no endorsement. Hey, is that what you're saying, Eric? I should endorse Hitchhiker's Guide. Anyway, one of the points in there is somebody wants to be the president of the galaxy or the universe or something. And somebody else makes a comment that anybody who actually wants that job should be fundamentally and initially made ineligible to hold it. So it essentially says that those who want power for the sake of power are in it for the wrong reasons. And so that point does make it into the book.
I love that. I love that concept of power for the sake of power should not be your guiding light. Is there a quote from Guardians of the Galaxy? Maybe that is the quote, but that kind of inspires you, or is there a quote from any other area of your life that kind of drives you and keeps you motivated and moving forward?
Sure. First of all, it's Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy rather than Guardians of the Galaxy.
Oh, sorry.
Your age is showing. So one of the books starts, this is not the one I would necessarily suggest, but it's one's a bit memorable to me. It says, in the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very unhappy and has been widely regarded as a bad move. So not necessarily one I live by. But if there is one that I do live by and it shows up fairly commonly, and it works well in the local government realm as well. It's a Ben Franklin quote, and it says, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we will all hang separately." And I use that oftentimes in orientations for new city or county councils, talking about in Canada anyway, there's no party affiliation and typically no parties involved in local government at all, with a few exceptions. But what it speaks to is that you have political capital that you get to expend over the course of your term. And you might as well work together with your colleagues. Typically, it's all type A people who get involved in local government for obvious reasons. They all want to see something done. And if they help each other, more will get done than if they are constantly battling each other. I mean, we often see on councils in a 4-year term, after years 2 or 3 and into year 4, so starting to prepare for the next election, that sometimes these collegiality pieces go out the window a little bit, and people are trying to show that they're the financial hawk or they're the empath on council, and realizing that if they're one member of 5 or 7 or 13, they really can't get very much done. So they do all have to hang together, or the population is going to democratically retire the lot of them, and they will all hang separately.
Well, that sounds almost synonymous, or at least synchronous, with power for the sake of power should not be driving you. You know, that those who lead us should be looking towards working together versus, you know, serving only their one purpose.
And essentially that, I'm a bit of a Pollyanna when it comes to local government. I believe that people who run for office almost always do it for the right reasons. I think there has to be a shred of ego involved in it as well, or else you wouldn't believe that there was something that you had, that you were the best candidate for the job. But those people who run as public servants rather than self-servants and get elected I have a lot of admiration for. It's a tough job with very little gratitude, and in many cases, very little remuneration as well. We often talk about work-life balance, and the work-life balance for an elected official essentially is what they make it. If you're in a small town, everybody knows you, whether you're lined up at the library or the grocery store, or just stop for dinner at a restaurant, and you're going to get bugged. If you work in a larger municipality, perhaps that's not quite so much the case, but in those larger municipalities, there's often more to do, and you often have staff to assist, whereas in small municipalities, you just don't. So I think people are often in it for the right reasons. We have started to do something, or promoted something like, we're calling it candidate orientations, like a year in advance of an election or 9 months in advance of an election, where people can come and kick the tires of what the job really looks like. So maybe you're just mad that somebody didn't fill the potholes on Main Street, and you're going to get in there and you're going to clean out council and bring change. So 6 months in, that's been dealt with one way or another. Now what are you going to do? You got a rogue on council for the next 3.5 years who doesn't really know what value they're bringing to council. So anyway, by doing these orientations before the elections, we're really reinforcing in those people who are doing it for the right reason that in fact they are on the right path. And we're hopefully dissuading those people, or making them think twice a little bit about whether the job is really what they think it's about.
So I'm going to go off script a little bit. This was not one of the questions, but I'm particularly interested in that orientation process that you just described. Can you tell me what is an important question that you ask during those orientations?
Why are you here? Essentially, and it's a bit of a flippant question, but really it's not as well. What I'm looking for is in an individual's motivation. Sometimes people have grown up through community service. They've been on the Rotary Club. They were a sports team parent and did bottle drives. they got involved in a bunch of different things. Maybe they got on a town committee, and now this is kind of the next step in how they serve their community. Others are those people who are just mad and want to bring change. And others, particularly I see this in the business environment, maybe it's the chamber, maybe it's individual members of business who want to bring a more business-like focus to council. So when I ask why they're here, it sometimes gets to their own individual philosophy. And I think if I ask it in that way, sometimes it takes them aback a little bit, and I hopefully get them to think in a slightly lateral fashion than otherwise. But yeah, so anyway, those are that's the way I would start with questions. When we do that, if it's a candidate orientation, if possible, we will bring either a member of council who's not running in the next election, or a retired municipal government councillor from some other jurisdiction to give a little bit of the nuts and bolts and to talk a lot about things like the work-life balance that I mentioned just a little bit ago.
That's great. You mentioned your approach to somebody who is going into public service versus somebody who is in the business environment. What is the biggest difference in how you approach those two different segments?
So I said public service versus self-service. And I think you can be a public servant with a business background. I think you can be a public servant with a social background, all full of heart. So I don't know. I think it's more around values and principles of the individual than it is around left and right on the political spectrum. You want, at least maybe I shouldn't say you in this case, I want my municipal council to represent the breadth of my community. I want them to be the people who are strong in sport, the people who are strong in social services, who are strong in business. Now, in a ward or division based system, I want my representative to be the most skilled. But most of all, I want the council to represent the breadth of the community. Of course, I only have one vote in my community, so it's a hope. But my hope is that the strong candidates from left to right and based on various interests are coming together with goodwill.
So Ian, if you have somebody who comes in and you ask that question, why are you here? And it isn't clear, how do you help guide them towards a clear path?
By doing this in advance of an election, my hope is asking the question that they will ruminate on it. I'm not sure that there's a lot I can do, but there is community support. Nobody runs for office without support of some sort or another, even before. They're not just going out to gather votes. They've got friends and family and business colleagues and social colleagues who've backed them. So those are the support group to the people. I mean, you hear elected people saying if we get a phone call or an email, we know that represents more than one person. The same could be said for in advance of an election too. If a candidate is speaking to people, you know that is going to be reflective of an opinion of a larger section of the constituency, not just the individual. And by doing it far enough in advance of an election, and they maybe haven't spent a whole lot of money on brochures and signs and things like that, there's no reason that they are committed beyond stepping back if they don't want to be. Now that said, we have the freedom to express ourselves, and should the individual say Ian's full of it, I'm still going to run, absolutely they can. As they can get the people to sign their nomination form, or they can get people to vote for them, they can certainly serve on council, though they may run into a bit of a rocky situation as they go through their council year or council years with other people who have been elected with slightly different platforms, with slightly different values and principles, but still wanting to see the success of their community. It's not uncommon on a large council, a large city council, or a large county council to see one or two members who are going to vote no to everything. And they just they stop being relevant. And they're voting no on stuff so that they can say when they run for re-election that they were minding the public purse or something to that effect. But in reality, they're not really adding any value while they're there.
Great. Thank you for that answer. I have one more, and then I see Chris has joined us. But you did happen to say that somebody could say, Ian, I'm going to go on regardless of what you have warned me about or helped me to identify that I'm lacking. If somebody does choose that and goes down that path, what kind of support or guidance could you offer them once they're in that position?
First of all, they need to want it. If they believe that they have their own private kitchen cabinet and are using them as their own advisors, chances are they're not going to reach out to me. If they do reach out to me, I'm going to get back to my fundamentals about what do you want your community to look like a generation from now, and how are you going to help get it there? If you're looking at the transactional short-term stuff, you're filling potholes and dealing with barking dogs, that's nice, but we really don't get to strategy in that case. You as governors are charged with thinking above the fray, and amongst yourselves, that odd number of people are responsible for working together. You are by default each other's first team. You will know more about your community than even your spouse. Well, you should know more about your community than your spouses do if you're managing to keep things in camera or in closed session. So you have to work together with these people. That the constituents have brought you together. If you're going to go rogue on that, you're going to get nothing done. It's going to be even more frustrating. So that person, I mean, they're certainly able to run for office, and if they can gather the votes, they'll serve on council. We're now here in Alberta, we're now entering year 4 of a 4-year term. And I've been a little surprised recently with the number of places where we're seeing resignations on council. I think that people are, I live near Edmonton, we had a Metro Edmonton town lose its mayor last week. Mayor resigned, he couldn't work with other members of council. Maybe he said, I'm not going to run again, why don't I just cut bait now? We also see municipalities where one or more members of council are forming a block, and you end up with a 2-3 split or a 5-3 split or something to that effect. That just know how things are going to vote is not terribly useful. So dealing with that person who may not be in it for the most altruistic of reasons, and maybe they're more for ego fulfillment than for public service. Ultimately, it's up to that person. We can provide guidance. The municipality will often have a professional development budget, and hopefully it's being used. And if it's not, there are some questions to be asked about why aren't we looking for good practices, best practices, wise practices beyond our own borders. We got to, again, we all got to hang together, or most assuredly we will all hang separately.
Excellent tie back to that quote. Chris
There you go.
We asked Ian for a quote that inspires him, and it was a Ben Franklin quote that I'm not gonna get it right. But I wrote down the first part. We must all hang together, or certainly we will all hang individually.
Yeah, or most assuredly we will all hang separately. Yeah, that's the idea, though. I think you're right there, Liz.
So he just brought that back beautifully. And with that, I'm going to let Chris take over the hosting duties.
Thanks a lot, Liz, and thanks, Ian. Sorry for jumping in here. I'll fill in that part of the story. That might be an interesting part of the exchange here. But moved from Virginia now to your neck of the woods. Ian, thank you. I'm so excited to get into some more of these discussions. I would love to get to hearing a little bit more about the mission of your organization, Strategic Steps, and your work there.
Sure. So I came by Strategic Steps organically, if you like. By trade, I am an association management, professional association manager. I'm not sure how many of our people here are from the US, but in Canada, the function of property assessment is done by the municipality, by staff, rather than anybody who gets elected as an assessor. So I started out as the executive director of the Professional Assessors Associations of Alberta. From that point, I got recruited to go and work for the Alberta department that's responsible for local government. In the Canadian Constitution, there is no formal recognition of local government as a formal order of government, unlike in the US there is. So what it means is each of our provinces and territories can look after local government however they see fit. Now, for the most part, it's pretty much the same coast to coast to coast. But anyway, so I was working for the Department of Municipal Affairs for about 5 years in dealing with local governments. I was also a member of a Rotary Club, and through some iterative pieces, I was trying to get out of the business that I was in because I found some restraints or constraints I was doing some work with IT consulting and some work with the provincial government as well. And I found some constraints with that. So I was looking to get out of that business and had a love for local government. And in my Rotary Club was a fellow by the name of Dennis Common, who was trying to get out of the same business by retiring. So essentially he and I worked out an agreement, and I took over his company. So I started from his shoulders rather than from the ground. And along the way, then the company has built and grown. Primarily, though, it operates in the space between elected officials and senior managers. So we're looking at things like, we've talked about council and candidate orientations already, but we also get into things like developing a strategy, strategic plans. Some people call them official community plans or other names around all over the place. And I see it's interesting too, because Jean's on this call, and I worked with her town on a strategic plan a few years ago too. So we do strategic plans, and out of that come statutory work, what we would call bylaws and policies, what you call codes and ordinances. I'll try and translate. That's one of the things I always enjoy doing when I speak in the States, is trying not to use words that mean nothing to you. So we deal with those. We're getting into some of these issues now in the council term with conflict or conduct on a municipal council, whether it's real or whether it's perceived conflicts of interest or conflicts between members of council, which might not be financial, but might still be stunting the ability of the municipality to grow. As I was saying to Liz before you joined, I've been on the tangential edges of priority-based budgeting too. And I really think if you look at strategy in terms of determining what's important and what's timely in a strategic plan, say, that translates really nicely, I think, into putting money into priorities. Because all a budget is a fiscal manifestations of the priorities of the community. So whether it's done through something like priority-based budgeting, or whether it's done through narrowing the focus on a strategic plan, it's really important that those high value things get funded first. So we do a lot of other little bits and pieces too. I mentioned some of the wisdom, this writing of the book and speaking at conferences are things I enjoy. But for the most part, it's working in that space between elected officials and administrators.
I would love to even go deeper into that. I know I've heard that from you before as well, that you live in that space between elected officials and administrators or organizations managers. What is most important about that space? I mean, I've never heard it described quite like that before.
It's a vacuum, should be a vacuum between the two. Actually, role clarity, I think, is really important. Right from day one is the understanding of governance is governance, management is management, and ne'er the twain shall meet. There is that city, town, county manager who sits in the middle of the two and kind of operates a little bit in both worlds. But a council that doesn't understand their roles and really wants to get into operations is something that we see fairly commonly, whether it's an entire council or just a member or two. One of the reasons I think that that's the case is if someone has worked their way up through the community system, working in their own community, playing and volunteering in their community, they're used to doing stuff. If they're on the baseball, the Little League Parents Association, they're out raising funds and doing bottle drives and whatnot. If they're part of Rotary, they're raising money for good community events and actually getting out and planting trees and doing other community events. And then when they get elected, which is kind of a next step in a lot of cases, the assumption seems to be that, well, it's just a continuation of the same kind of job. So it stays operational. So one of the toughest things we do is try and get people to think above the level of the tactical and operational. We often ask the question, why? So if they say, I used the example earlier about potholes. The council says we got to fill the potholes on Main Street, and I'll say, well, why? And they'll say we'll start working our way up through that ladder. So the why becomes so we have smooth roads, which in and of itself doesn't really matter. But why do you want smooth roads? For efficient transportation. Why do you want efficient transportation? So we can build the economy or create a sustainable economy in the area. Now we're starting to get into the realm of government. And it also then, if council gives the direction that says, hey, you know, we're interested in economic diversification. I mean, everybody's interested in that. Then it gives a place for administration to work, to provide some innovation within the umbrella of that particular realm. And they can draw a thread then, perhaps right from a municipal vision statement, all the way down to that person who is actually fixing that fellow's pothole, and not just because they want the pothole fixed. So to me, anyway, that's that place. I don't often see the opposite. I don't see managers and administrators wanting to get into governance. When they do, though, it's often a case of a space that's been vacated by council. A council that doesn't necessarily understand their role may let an ambitious town manager or city manager get into a space that they ought not to be in. And so that becomes an important place for the orientation again, so everybody can hear the same thing at the same time, whether they're elected or appointed. And it also becomes a place then to be careful about what shows up in that town or city manager's contract in terms of goals for the next year. Are they operational goals? Are they strategic goals? Are they governance goals? And they ought not to be governance goals. But doing things like delivering on council's strategic plan is something that council can reasonably suggest in their city manager's contract is something that they may want to do. I've heard it said, and it shows up in the book too, that a quote from one of my mentors who worked for the Alberta government was, what interests council fascinates the hell out of me. And that's the way it ought to work, from council through to the CAO, and then the city manager, and then the city manager down to department heads, and department heads down to the lifeguards. Doesn't go the other way around all the time, of course, but it ought to cascade, and there should be that clear thread that says the lifeguard, for example, is in fact helping work on the delivering the municipal vision. It goes back to that Kennedy quote about that janitor who, when he was asked what he was doing, didn't say he was sweeping the room. He said it was helping put a man on the moon. So it's the same sort of thing in local government, just a bit of a microcosm.
Yeah, that is fascinating. It must be at times very fulfilling in your role to help elected officials, help council focus on that role and establish vision. And I'm sure at other times it's hard, to say the least.
Well, you can have, sorry.
No, go ahead. I would love for you to talk about that.
You can have both hard and fulfilling. And in fact, sometimes the harder that is, the more fulfilling it is too. I was saying to Kelly, who I think is still on the call here today, that we were working on an intermunicipal project between a city and a county fairly recently that slogged on for quite a long period of time. And it was a tough row to hoe. Historical animosities between the two communities had not helped us. So trust had to be built. Principles of collaboration had to be built. A shared vision of success had to be built. But yesterday or the day before was a joint press release was issued from these two communities to say that, hey, we've actually done this and we've actually gone further than we thought we were going to. So it was tough, but very fulfilling. If the work was easy, I'm not sure that it would be fascinating. I really enjoy what I get to do, and the more I get to do it, the more I realize that I don't know things, and so I like bringing people on. So a strategic steps project is probably not just me. It could be me or people who work with me as colleagues or associates as well. So as a bunch of small fish swimming together, we can do the same job that a pretty big fish can do as well. And that I really find that piece quite fulfilling, is bringing together a specialized team with a relatively low overhead because they're not full-time staff, and we're delivering value for the client in the long term. I really like it when that happens, and I'd like it even better when we get repeat business from that client, because it's kind of an assurance that, hey, you guys are actually on the right track.
Kind of going down this path, I like the spirit of hard work, and I'm going to try to pivot from that to unique challenges. And if you could share any specific example of a unique challenge you've seen an organization face, and what were the strategic steps, so to speak, that they went through to deal with it?
Again, we're working primarily in the municipal realm. Absence of strategy is a unique challenge. It's not uncommon for us to work with a small town or even a city that says they've never had something like a strategic plan, or even a business plan in some cases. It makes me wonder how they determine what they ought to put money into. And that's where things obviously like PBB come into play too. But the unique challenge is, how do we get them over that hurdle of creating a first strategy that they can start to build on, and once we disengage, they continue to work with. And to me, it's a challenge, but it's really gratifying when it happens. Whenever we do that governance level planning, one of the pieces we build into it is a review schedule. So what's a high priority today, what's important and what's timely, is not necessarily going to be a high priority a year from now. Something may have been completed and it can come off the list, which gives a little bit of extra capacity, and maybe another priority can now go onto that list. Or the world has shifted and global commodity prices have changed, and now what we thought we could do, we no longer can. COVID hits, and all of a sudden we have to lay off a whole bunch of people and cut back. And it's been interesting as I've watched. COVID is a good example too, because as I watched municipalities, some of the things that they've been cutting back on, things like transit and recreation, are really high cost, low return on investment things. So some municipalities are starting to run surpluses because they've cut back on some of these things. Now, all of those things that they've cut back on, of course, were demand. They were started because a group of people said, hey, this is a really good idea. We should build a pool in town. Sure, that's great. It probably keeps happening, but now we've had to shut it down for a little while. The other thing that's interesting, perhaps a unique challenge, is the water we swim in, culture, history, all that sort of thing. In a community that has set itself up over 50 or 100 years or more, has got a suite of services and programs and built amenities and facilities based on the demands of the day. We've started to see those now having to be repurposed, but those were still demands of the day. So, I mean, pickleball is big around here. And we've seen some places change tennis courts into pickleball courts. So what that's meant is there aren't as many places for people to play tennis, but I really haven't heard a huge hue and cry about it, because what was popular perhaps in the 1970s has waned, and now this is built up in its stead. So we replace one thing from another. So in as much as it's a political decision to start something, it's a political decision to end something as well. And so those are the sort of things I see as some of the challenges. The government, that's a small change, but there are some pretty big ones too, particularly around the economy, as we see communities that rely on resource extraction or exploitation, whether that's fishing or oil and gas. Those rise and fall over a long cycle. But I see one of the real jobs of council is to think about what's the peak of the next hill. And here in Canada, they legalized cannabis last year. And when I was doing strategy work a year or two ago, every municipality would say, hey, somehow we got to get into the cannabis business because they've legalized it. And now we can get into regulating it and making some money off it somehow. I don't think they actually turned into dealers, but they turned into the helpers of the dealers, I guess, enablers of dealers. That's right. So, but what it meant was, by the time we were starting to discuss this at strategy sessions, that boat had probably left already. So the really imaginative councils are beating the bushes or thinking about and imagining what can be 10, 20, 30 years from now and saying, there's a risk that we're going to do something that's not going to work, but we really want to innovate. We want to be known as the leader in whatever it happens to be. Council needs to give permission to innovate, but it also needs to give permission for risk. And the public sector is structurally risk adverse, particularly larger public sectors where you get retarding influences just because of the size of the organization. Some of the smaller ones can be more agile, and that's kind of neat to see. So, I mean, there are those kind of systemic things, and there are things associated with politics as well.
Ian, this is off script a little bit, but it's I'm fascinated by a number of things that you just said. And when you talked about in COVID, an organization going from deficit to they make a couple of moves and all of a sudden they're in surplus. And prior to deficit, they were probably in surplus before the commodity the pricing changed, and then they were in deficit, and then they made a couple of operational changes, then they're into surplus. We talk a lot with our organizations about resource repurposing, and your pickleball and tennis courts is physical resource repurposing. Your deficit to surplus is repurposing resources from certain areas of allocation. And I'd love to hear your perspective on the current state of that skill set to create what you might call resource liquidity, the ability to move kind of quickly, and its need for the future.
So I'll start this off with, I was going to introduce this a little earlier. I don't know if anybody has ever read this book. It's called Loon Shots. I'd certainly put this one on my list as well. It's a book that talks about changing phases. Hey, there you go. Do you want to do the book reports, Chris? So it's about how you move essentially from structural point A to structural point B, either through a phase shift in strategy or phase or strategy shift, and how a team that did something the first time isn't nearly as capable as a team who does something or is more capable than this team that does it a second time. One of the examples they use is movie studios. Disney came out with The Lion King, and then when it started to come out with subsequent movies, they didn't do nearly as well as The Lion King. And they're saying what their suggestion here is the team that you put together to deliver that innovative piece isn't the same team that is required to produce the follow-up. And I think you could say the same thing in terms of resource allocation or reallocation within the public sector, or probably within the business environment. Business perhaps can pivot a little, well, can definitely pivot faster than the public sector can. So it's got a structural advantage in that way. To me, those innovative councils which give their administrations the ability to do some prudent risking are the ones that are going to be sustainable in the long run. We see the lack of sustainability showing up in, when we talk about it, it often means finance, means we don't have enough money to do all the stuff we want to do. But sustainability can also be other things. It can be natural assets, whether it's assets of the population or assets of place that can be taken advantage of and gradually will erode over time. What are the concepts you may know about we've been working on the last little while, is the concept of well-being. Talking about why people move to a community, what makes them stay there, what kind of assets does somebody have that they can provide to their community, assets meaning skills and whatnot. So it's building that sense of small c community within the larger geographical community, recognizing that the definition of community has changed over the last little while. What used to be community used to be geographical, used to be me and my neighbors and the person down the street and the corner restaurant. Now the definition of community seems to be more interest-based because of interconnectivity. So my wife's part of a knitting community, but that knitting community exists all over the continent for all I know. And I'm part of I mentioned Rotary Club, I'm part of an online Rotary community that can be all over the place as well, but it's based on interest. I may not know my neighbors 2 doors down, but I know somebody from across the country. And that produces a unique challenge for a municipality when it really comprises a whole series of smaller communities within it. And what are they known for? Are they known for support of seniors? Are they known for handicrafts? Are they smaller ones in particular? But to me, those are some of the obstacles that municipalities are facing in the 21st century. And post-COVID, that they really didn't have to face it probably in the 60s and 70s with our parents' generation was running things.
I want to leverage that and what a 21st century community looks like, and also talk about, I liked your unique challenge of the absence of strategy. Ian, you've shared with us a vision or a diagram, and if you wouldn't mind, I was hoping to be able to show it to the audience here.
Sure.
And I'll work on sharing my screen as I bring this up. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, so if you'd like, Chris, I can speak to this a bit. This is this is a bit of a work in progress. Some of my folks and other people, we're trying to think of this grand unification theory of local government, how things are always interconnected. And so we've been playing with this model over time. And I know, Chris, you and Eric and some of your colleagues have provided some input to it as well in terms of changes that we haven't made them to this. What we have said here is that everything is interrelated, and fundamentally it's about the people who choose to live in a geographical location, whether that's a county or a city or a village or whatever the case may be, or just a rural area. If you look here just by color, the blue is citizen focused, the orange is governance or government focused, and then management is in green. And along the bottom here, you see 2 arrows, one of which is just time, indicating, I mean, if you wanted to say this is a year, we could say it's a year. If you want to say it's the course of a strategic plan or a council's term, we could do the same thing. We also saw that blue arrow about well-being growth, that we want to make our community better by the time we're done with it, or by the time our contribution is complete than it was at the beginning. We want to build that sense of community or communities within that town or village or city or county. So the way this really starts is with the desires of the people who live in the place. If nobody lived there, then there would really be no benefit to having a government, or there would be no need for a government either. So the citizens get together and say, hey, I don't want to look after all my interests all the time. I'm going to get some other people to help me with that, which is where the creation of a local government happens. And citizens too are part of organizations, whether that's social organizations or cultural organizations or sport organizations or anything. And they will have desires too, like those pickleball courts. And then business has desires too. The Chamber of Commerce is often talking about whether we should have a business tax or a local improvement tax, or whether we should not, and whether taxes are too high or, well, they never say they're too low. So to me, anyway, that's the first piece. Then government gets involved. And really all government is a subset of the citizenry who's delivering on those desires. And so I've said, based on the size of these circles here, about what's the significance in terms of effort. So I think a strategic plan requires a lot of effort. And within that strategic plan, I think, is a vision. And to me, a vision is a statement of future success sometime into the future. So I often say a generation, because sometimes it's hard to say whether it's 5 years or 20 years or 25 years. The number, when you look that far out, is kind of arbitrary, because we're going to have a chance to review it between now and then too. So once a vision is set, a strategic plan is determined, and a subset of priorities within that plan are underway, we can assign dollars to it. We're assigning dollars based on priority. So what's important gets done, what's timely gets done. And I talk about high priority as kind of being that combination of importance and timeliness, recognizing that it's going to change over time. Then it's a handoff, if you like, to the local government structure, which is where the business plan comes in. My hope would be in a small municipality, perhaps there's just a business plan, but in a larger one, there are other plans that kind of fit within that context. So department or divisional plan, or an IT plan, or a human resource plan. And these could be to do with capital spending, or they could be to do with operational deliverables as well. Once the business plan, budget, everything's in place, the marching orders are given, we start looking at service delivery, which is how that person who's the lifeguard can see themselves kind of cascading down from the vision. So people are receiving what they wanted in their desires. This is a little bit less size than the citizen desires, recognizing you can't be all things to all people. We've got communications and engagement as part of this, communication being how the municipality communicates or speaks to people, often done through things like press releases and maybe council members' newsletters or posts on social media. And then engagement is the two-way piece. And of course, there's a continuum of engagement, which goes from everything which might just be communication to pushing information out, to the other end of the spectrum, which is actually empowering somebody else to make a decision. And that last piece becomes a little bit difficult in government, because ultimately council's the decision-making body. So engagement really just gets as far as providing a recommendation to council in this case, but I still think it's important as a two-way street. Once the services have been delivered, you're looking at measuring the deliverable. We'd be looking at some short-term measures in terms of outputs and some long-term measures in terms of outcomes. Those sort of things are all important, because they can then feed back into how effective the service delivery was, and were we delivering the right things to the right people at the right time. Reporting is a big piece of this too, whether it's reporting internally, like things like audits, or whether it's reporting to the public. And that comes out of what we actually did. And then citizens are either happy or they're not happy based on what you had provided. You as a municipality had provided, and then the feedback goes to last year's citizen satisfaction should inform next year's citizen desire. So it's a bit of a closed loop here, and I recognize this isn't perfect or final. It's something we've been playing with. So I'd certainly, if we get to the point, I'd be interested in other people's take on this. I know ResourceX has had some comments on it as well, and those are really appreciated. So Chris, that's kind of the précis, or maybe it's even the long-winded version of this grand unification.
Oh, it's great. It's awesome. And you can see clearly when you were talking earlier about the unique challenge of an absence of strategy, you can see the consequences of that overall in your diagram. You can see the consequences of not trying to understand or get the feedback loop of citizen satisfaction. I think it's definitely powerful. Is this included in your book?
A modified version of it. I've been playing with it ever since. The book started a year ago, actually almost exactly a year ago. And this has kind of been something I developed out of it. You, as far as I know, actually, ResourceX might have been the first group that I actually shared it with, just to get your take on it. Maybe I can build a whole speech around that.
Well, amen. I mean, even as we were including it in this particular interview, there is a lot to dig into. Speaking of your book, would you mind getting into a little bit about what is covered? You don't have to blow the whole thing. I mean, we want people to go ahead and take a look at it. But
should I start reading at the introduction and just see how far we get? So the book is, as I mentioned at the beginning, is called "Who's Driving the Grader and Other Governance Questions." I started writing this almost a year ago when I was stuck in a blizzard in Nunavut in the northwest corner of Hudson's Bay in November. I was there to do an orientation for all the newly elected mayors. So they brought them all together because it's such a diverse place. They brought them all into a little place called Rankin Inlet. So I was there to do the orientation, and the joke was that I overnighted there for 5 days because all the flights were canceled. And while we were there, not a lot to do, one of my colleagues sent a list of what she called Ianisms, which became chapter titles. And she said, these are the things you always seem to say. Why don't you write a chapter on each one of these things? So I did. And I mean, some of these you'll recognize because they're things that other people say too. So things like no strategy survives first contact with reality, or another one, it's never about what it's about, or was it snacks drive engagement. So they're kind of a little bit semi-flippant chapter titles, but there are governance principles embedded in each of them. And a lot of them are based on my own experience, or the experience of colleagues as we've worked kind of around Western Canada in particular, but around the continent, if you like, too. So that's kind of the first piece. The second piece of the book, or part two, is gets away from those kind of stories, fables, lessons, if you like. Each chapter ends with a couple of questions for consideration. And the second part of the book deals with what I call local government leadership. And it's about the principles of what I see as good governance and a bit of a hierarchy of those principles. We talked earlier about people who are in this job or in a local elected official job for their own reasons, or whether they're in it for public service. So that's the sort of thing that shows up. It's not a terribly long book, and it was fun to write. I started writing it almost as a catharsis, and then the publisher reached out to me and said, we'd be interested in publishing it. Can you add another 30,000 words? So that's how it came to be. And I think I was pretty fortunate, both that I didn't have to go looking for a publisher, and second, that it's only taken a year kind of from start to finish. And it was being printed last week or this week, and it should be shipped momentarily. So it's really built for local government, and I think it's built for either or both municipal administrators and for elected officials as well. It's a fairly easy read, and you can do a chapter or two at a time.
Thanks, Ian. I put the link in the chat. If maybe that was done earlier, but just make sure everybody has access to it overall. I did want to make sure we had time for any of the participants who might have some specific questions of Ian to come off mute or type a question in the chat. I can pause for just a second if somebody wants to dive in. I have a couple more questions, but I was just making sure
you and I can just have a conversation about loon shots if you like.
Sounds great.
The other book I've got here is The World According to Mr. Rogers, which is a whole bunch of quotes from Mr. Rogers, which I really enjoyed over the last little while.
That's fantastic. Liz, this is going to be a fun newsletter as we publish the book recommendations of Ian McCormack.
Yeah.
Liz's question was, what's the story behind the white binders behind you? And they look pretty fascinating overall. This could be other.
Yeah, that's my ego shelf. Each one of those is a project binder, and I've said I can't take up more than one bookcase with project binders, so they run through there as we deal with them, and then I just put them in an envelope and put them away. In reality, I almost never look at them, so it just makes me feel good that I actually got something done over the last little while. And because of my OCD, they all had to be the same. If you look at the bottom shelf, they're not quite the same, and those are some of the older ones before I invested in shares in Staples.
There you go, Liz.
There you go, Liz.
Hey, I have a couple more questions if you have time for it, and anybody who wants to chime in, at least indicate that you've got a question in chat. That'd be great. Don't hog the rest of the time. Ian, you've spent a lot of time in strategic planning. I'll get to Ken's question first, and then okay. I'll hold mine for a second. Ken says there are many new changes to the MGA that impact the coming elections. Do you see these as positive, negative, or neutral to good local governance?
Nice to hear from you, Ken. MGA is the Municipal Government Act for anybody who's outside Alberta. That's the governing legislation. Ken, you and I have talked about this a little bit, I think, and it was before some of these changes came into effect. I see them on balance as negative. We have in Alberta, we have a government which is tending towards the right side of the spectrum. And what it's done is taken public money out of the public realm and put private money into the public realm, or provided space for private money into the public realm. And I don't think that that's going to bring candidates for election, or we have our local government elections on October 18th of next year, a 4-year cycle. I don't think that the additional money that is coming from the private sector is going to do a whole lot of benefit for local government. We're starting to see the ability for more money to go into political action committees, which historically we haven't had. So there are now third parties which can start to get involved either for or against candidates, and we're starting to see some of those candidates come forward. Ordinarily, people who on their own records likely would not be able to get themselves elected, but with a lot of money behind them, might be able to tip the balance in their favor. Well, not that recently, I suppose. We had a couple of terms ago, we had a change come for to extend terms. We were at 3-year terms, and now we're at 4-year terms. I think on balance, that's been a good suggestion, a good move. But to me, putting more money into elections, I don't think is a recipe for good governance. Ken, I hope that answers your question. And I'd say the same thing about whether it's local governments or state or provincial government as well. What it does is it stops people having to work quite so hard. Ken says we'll talk offline. Indeed, Ken.
Lots to do.
Lots to do. Do you know one of the interesting things about the position I end up in is there are some things that I'm quite happy to provide advice about that I wouldn't put my face behind. I believe in the principles of good government. I had a call last week, or a video with somebody who was just about to kick off their campaign to run for the mayor of Calgary. So 1.2 million people. He wanted to spend half an hour, somebody who's not on council at the moment, wants to run for mayor right off the bat and doesn't really understand the role of local government. So first of all, I appreciated that he would reach out. And I said to him that this is the stuff that I believe, and I would provide the same information and advice to any of the candidates, regardless of where they are on the political spectrum. That values and principles to me outweigh your political perspective. The reason for that is I want somebody who I can trust to make a decision 3 or 4 years from now on an issue of which I have no idea yet. I want to be able to trust them. I can ask them their position on the issues of the day, but that's going to get resolved in the short term. If somebody has values that I can agree with, I can be reasonably I can have reasonable faith that they are going to exercise those values on topics that haven't even shown up yet.
Ian, we're right at the end of the hour. Thank you so much for making the time and having this conversation with us. And thanks to everybody who participated. If anybody did have one more question, feel free to jump right in. We posted a link to the book. We're certainly excited about the work that you're doing, Ian and Kelly Rudek as well, and your thoughtfulness and your vision and the presence of strategy in your work. So we're thankful to have you as a part of our exchange series and look forward to other opportunities to possibly do some work together. So just wanted to say thank you, everybody else. Thank you, Ian, for being here today. We have our next exchange is going to be with the city of Littleton, Colorado, who was one of the creators of the Littleton Pick 3 idea, which was an innovation to look at the blueprint and try to come up with 3 programs where they could designate the future of the program, which is quite an interesting exercise. So Stacey Covington's going to be there. Following that, I know we have Kirsten Wyatt from ELGL is going to be joining us. So lots of things to look forward to. Hope everybody has a great U.S. Thanksgiving holiday if you're celebrating. And once again, Ian, thanks for being here. And we'll look forward to catching up with you soon.
Thanks very much, everybody. I really appreciated it.
Alrighty. Thanks.
Have a good day.
Ian, how's it going?
Good.
I'm gonna say hi.